Before the Founding Fathers, before the American flag ever flew, the land we now call the United States was home to millions of people who had built lives, cultures, and societies over thousands of years. These people, Native Americans, were not primitive or nomadic wanderers as often portrayed in outdated history books. They were members of organized, complex civilizations with unique languages, religions, agricultural systems, and governing structures. Evidence shows that humans first arrived in North America over 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier through the Bering Land Bridge from Asia during the Ice Age. Over millennia, these early settlers adapted to every type of environment from arid deserts to dense forests to vast plains, developing distinct cultures based on the land they inhabited. They formed trade routes, created cities, and practiced spiritual traditions deeply connected to nature. In the Mississippi Valley, the Mississippian culture thrived from around 800 CE to 1600 CE, their greatest city, Cahokia, located near modern-day St. Louis, had an estimated population of 20,000 at its peak, larger than London at the time. They built massive earthen mounds, some over 100 feet tall, used for religious and political purposes. These weren't just dirt hills. They were engineered structures with terraces, plazas, and wooden temples placed atop them. The society was highly stratified and organized, supported by advanced agriculture and long-distance trade networks that extended to the Great Lakes and Gulf Coast. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, also known as the Anasazi, carved their homes into cliffs and built intricate stone dwellings known as pueblos. The remains of their cities, like those found in Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, show careful planning, astronomical alignment, and social coordination. They constructed multi-story buildings from sandstone blocks and lived in communities with hundreds of rooms. Their ability to farm in arid conditions using irrigation techniques shows a high level of environmental adaptation. The Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast, formed between the 12th and 15th centuries, was one of the most sophisticated political systems in the pre-Columbian Americas. It united 5, later 6 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora under a constitution known as the Great Law of Peace. It emphasized democratic principles, collective decision-making, and checks and balances. Historians and political scholars have noted that aspects of the Iroquois system likely influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution centuries later. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Northwest, tribes like the Haida and Tlingit lived in permanent villages and constructed totem poles that recorded their history and lineage. They relied on the rich marine environment for sustenance and developed complex ceremonies like the potlatch, a system of gift-giving that reinforced social status and community ties. In the Great Plains, nations such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche followed the seasonal movements of bison, a vital resource that provided food, shelter, tools, and clothing. They developed a mobile way of life centered around the horse, which was introduced to the Americas by the Spanish in the 1500s and revolutionized transportation and warfare on the plains. On the Atlantic coast, tribes such as the Powhatan, Wampanoag, and Lenape fished, farmed, and lived in semi-permanent villages. They cultivated the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, a trio of crops that nourished the soil and the people for generations. These were not isolated groups. Native nations traded goods and ideas across long distances. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico have been found in Great Lakes burial mounds. Copper from the Midwest made its way to the Southeast. There was a continent-wide web of contact long before any European arrived. But despite all this richness and complexity, these civilizations were nearly wiped from history after 1492. Their contributions were ignored, their lands taken, and their people decimated. But in this moment before contact with Europe, America was already alive. It just wore a different face. A face we must remember, not romanticize. Because to understand the true story of America, we must begin with the people who lived here. First, in 1492, a single voyage across the Atlantic Ocean altered the course of history forever. Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, reached the Caribbean islands. Mistakenly believing he had found a new route to Asia, what followed was not a simple journey of exploration, but the beginning of a centuries-long process of conquest, colonization, and cultural destruction. The collision between Europe and the Americas would reshape the world, but for the indigenous peoples who already lived on this land, it marked the beginning of an era of loss, resistance, and survival. As news of Columbus's discovery spread, European powers rushed to claim parts of the so-called New World. The Spanish established control over large parts of Central and South America, but they also ventured into what is now the southern and southwestern United States. Spanish explorers like Hernando de Soto and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado pushed into the interior, seeking riches and spreading Christianity. They built missions and forts, introduced horses and cattle, and brought diseases that devastated native populations who had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and influenza. The French entered from the north, exploring the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. They developed fur trade, networks with native nations, and founded settlements in Canada and parts of the interior U.S., including present-day Louisiana. While the French presence was smaller in population, their impact on trade, alliances, and the balance of power among tribes was significant. Meanwhile, the English focused their colonization efforts along the Atlantic coast. In 1607, they established their first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia. It was a difficult beginning. The early years were marked by starvation, disease, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy. But with the introduction of tobacco farming, the colony became profitable. Tobacco demanded labor, and soon, enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia, marking the beginning of a brutal and long-lasting system of slavery in English America. In 1620, a group of English separatists known as the Pilgrims landed further north in what is now Massachusetts. They established the Plymouth colony, seeking religious freedom. The Wampanoag people helped them survive their first harsh winter, sharing knowledge of local crops and fishing techniques. But these early moments of cooperation would not last. As more settlers arrived, their demand for land grew. Treaties were broken and tensions turned to violence. Over the next century, English colonies multiplied. 13 colonies emerged, each with its own economy, government, and cultural identity. These colonies were not unified but tied together loosely by their allegiance to the British Crown. Yet, even in these early years, the seeds of future conflict were being planted. The colonists brought with them European notions of land ownership, which clashed with indigenous understandings of shared territory. As settlers expanded westward, they encroached on native lands, sparking a series of bloody conflicts. One of the earliest and most devastating was the Pequot War in 1636, followed by King Philip's War in 1675, in which dozens of English towns were destroyed and entire native villages were wiped out. At the same time, the colonies became part of a larger imperial struggle. European powers constantly battled over territory and trade. These conflicts spilled into North America, culminating in the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, known globally as the 7 Years' War. It was a struggle between Britain and France for dominance over the continent. Native nations were drawn into the fight on both sides, hoping to protect their land or gain advantages. Britain eventually won, gaining control of vast territory, including Canada and all French lands east of the Mississippi River, but victory came at a price. The war left Britain deeply in debt. To recover, it began taxing the colonies, which would soon spark rebellion. But more immediately, it signaled a turning point. With the French threat removed, British colonists began pushing westward with greater force, further displacing native peoples and increasing tensions with both the Crown and the indigenous nations. By the early 1700s, the British colonies had grown economically and demographically. Ports like Boston, New York, and Charleston flourished. With trade, plantations in the South grew wealthy from tobacco, rice, and indigo on the backs of enslaved labor. Towns in the North became centers of commerce and early industry. A unique American identity was beginning to form, shaped by the land, the diversity of its people, and the constant push for opportunity, but beneath this growth, conflict simmered between settlers and native tribes, between colonists and their royal government, and between ideals of freedom and the reality of enslavement. The stage was set for a dramatic transformation. The colonies were no longer just outposts of an empire, they were on the brink of something far greater. By the early 1700s, the 13 British colonies along the Atlantic coast had become well established. They ranged from the fishing villages of New England to the tobacco plantations of Virginia and the rice fields of South Carolina. Life in these colonies was growing more stable and populations were rising quickly. But so were tensions both with native peoples and within the colonies themselves. For decades, the settlers had enjoyed a degree of autonomy. They had their own local governments, laws, and economies, even while technically under the rule of the British Crown. But that balance was about to shift dramatically. The major turning point came after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Britain had defeated France and gained control of vast new territories in North America. But the war had come at an enormous cost. The British government was deeply in debt, and it saw the colonies not as partners but as sources of revenue. To cover war expenses and the cost of maintaining British troops in the colonies, Parliament introduced a series of taxes and regulations. The first major act was the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to pay a tax on printed materials like newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. The colonists had no representation in the British Parliament, and they quickly adopted the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Protests erupted in every colony. Merchants boycotted British goods. Groups like the Sons of Liberty were formed to resist British authority. Sometimes violently, in response to growing unrest, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but soon replaced it with new taxes. The Townshend Acts in 1767 and later the Tea Act in 1773, these measures reignited anger throughout the colonies. Tensions reached a boiling point in Boston. On March 5, 1770, a confrontation between British soldiers and local residents ended in the Boston Massacre, where 5 colonists were killed. The event was heavily publicized by patriot leaders like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, who used it to stoke anti-British sentiment. The situation worsened in 1773 when the British government granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea imports to the colonies. Though the Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea, it was seen as another way for Britain to assert control. In protest, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party, and it sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Britain responded with a set of harsh laws called the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, as the colonists called them. They closed Boston Harbor, restricted town meetings, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England. These measures were meant to punish Massachusetts, but instead, they united the colonies in opposition. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. They demanded the repeal of the Intolerable Acts and organized more widespread boycotts of British goods. Still, most colonists hoped for a peaceful resolution. That hope would not last. In April 1775, British troops marched to the towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. Colonial militias known as Minutemen met them on the road. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it sparked a firefight that left several dead on both sides. This was the shot heard round the world, and it marked the beginning of open warfare between Britain and its American colonies. Just over a year later, on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. In bold and revolutionary language, the document announced that the 13 colonies were no longer part of the British Empire. They were now the United States of America. This was more than a political break. It was a profound moment in human history. A group of colonies made up of farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, and lawyers declared their right to self-govern, to choose their own leaders, and to build a nation based on liberty and equality, though. It would take generations for those ideals to be fully realized. The revolution had begun. And with it, a new chapter in history opened, one filled with sacrifice, war, and the difficult birth of a new nation. If you enjoyed this journey through history and want more real, powerful stories that shaped our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's so much more to uncover. This is just the beginning.